For the last look. It's been about a year since Dobbs v. Jackson, when the Supreme Court voted to revoke the constitutional protection for abortion in America. And in coming days, the court will weigh in on cases that will decide everything, from the future of affirmative action in university admissions, to the fate of President Biden's student loan forgiveness plan, to the right of American businesses to deny services to LGBTQ Americans. I asked my next guest to put the court's prior term in perspective and tell us what we could expect in the future. Michael Waldman is the president of the Brennan Center for Justice at NYU. His new book is called The Supermajority: How the Supreme Court Divided America. Michael Waldman, pleasure to have you on. You talk about the Supreme Court as a danger to American democracy these days. Most people would have thought, particularly if you go back 20, 30 years, that the court is sort of the savior of American democracy. What do you think has changed?
I think we have to rethink and understand the role the court is playing right now. It's a very unusual thing to have a Supreme Court with 9 unelected justices with lifetime appointments making such big decisions every June. We only give it that kind of power because we trust it to be above politics, to act like a court. Right now, the Supreme Court is dominated by 6 very conservative justices, a supermajority, and they've begun to make very, very radical, extreme, and activist rulings that are remaking society in basic ways. It poses a threat, I think, to our notions of democracy. It's changing the country in ways people are only beginning to understand, and I think it's going to lead to a pretty big backlash at the same time.
What would you say to conservatives who say, well, look, you had the Warren Court making liberal, big, important decisions that were liberal, and why was that okay, but this is not okay?
There have been times in the country's history where we need the court to take steps to protect equal rights, even when the political system isn't interested in it. Brown v. Board of Education is certainly a classic example of that, and that was the beginning of the Warren Court. But the Warren Court was the only time in the country's history where the court was very activist, but actually kind of ahead of the country, and it created its own backlash, a political backlash that we're living with to this day.
So, you know, what you're describing at this moment, it does seem to me accurate that the court is doing things that the public in general, majorities of the public, are not comfortable with, on abortion, even on guns, which you've written a wonderful book about the Second Amendment. You know, most people don't realize that the Second Amendment did not prevent 200 years of gun regulation, or maybe at least 100, certainly going back to the 1850s, and that it was a series of decisions, really starting with Heller, Scalia's opinion, that completely transformed the legal landscape for guns, right?
Right, you're exactly right. It's sort of hard to imagine, but the Supreme Court never said the Second Amendment protects an individual right to gun ownership until 2008. That was the Heller decision. But it still left room for gun laws, even though it was now seen as an individual right. Justice Scalia was asked, what's the difference between you and Justice Thomas? And he said, well, I am an originalist, but I am not a nut. Justice Thomas wrote the opinion more recently, the Bruen case. And that case, one of the really extraordinary decisions at the end of the last term in June of 2022, basically said you cannot consider public safety when you're looking at whether a gun safety law is constitutional. You can only look at history and tradition, by which they mean some law from the colonial era or from the founding era. If they had that law then maybe we can have it now. This is a very unusual way to rule.
And at the heart of all this is this idea of originalism, original intent. And you say in the book that it's fundamentally misconceived. Explain why.
It's misconceived. It's really pretty new. It wasn't until last year that the Supreme Court really started saying this is how we're going to make all our big rulings. It's the idea that the only legitimate way to interpret the Constitution is to ask what did it mean at the time it was ratified to the founders. The court ruled that the meaning of the Constitution is, quote, fixed. In a very literal way, what this means is that the social views, the social mores of property owning white men from the late 1700s or maybe the 1800s has to govern us now. And it's basically whatever the justices think they can find to bolster their argument. Sometimes it's terrifying. In the Dobbs case, they actually cited in the opinion, Justice Alito, 6 times a judge named Matthew Hale, who was a British judge who sentenced women to death for witchcraft. In the 1500s, yeah, not last year. And they understood, the founders understood, that they were creating a kind of a broad charter for a growing country, a country that would change. We have changed, we've evolved. The Constitution evolves with it, and that doesn't mean it's a misunderstanding of the Constitution. That's actually the only way to run a modern country.
And so when you look at where the court is now, and there is a kind of partisanship on both sides now, each president is appointing reliably conservative or liberal judges. You think the solution is basically to remake the court and to put in, for example, term limits?
I think one of the answers is to understand that the Supreme Court is an institution that can be reformed, that can be fixed, just the same as Congress or the executive branch. I think, for example, that nobody should hold too much public power for too long, so that an 18-year term limit for justices would make sense. It's actually broadly popular with the country. I think that people are just now starting to understand the Supreme Court as a political institution needing some kind of reform.
Michael Waldman, pleasure to have you on.
Thank you.
And thank you for being part of my program this week. I will see you next week.